Hey there everybody, it's Mr. V. Today we're going to talk about design principles for graphic design. So let's take a look at what is called a design principle. Most art, all the way down from caveman days to graphic design and print to fine art, even like different art styles from different cultures, from different histories, from different times, there are some universals that are applicable to art that if we take all of this and we distill it down into put it in a blender and we blend it all out to get to its most basic elements, we end up with what are called design principles. So what is a design principle? Well, design principles can be likened to, say, how you use a car on the road. A design element could be considered to be like the different things that make up a car in order to be a car. For example, like you would need tires, a steering wheel, a windshield, but if you have those, you have a car, okay? Now, a design principle is similar to, okay, what do you do when you get to a stop sign when driving a car? How do you change your oil? When do you yield to the right? And what happens if you run over, somebody on the street, So that would be what design principles are. How do you apply the use of these design elements? And remember, a design element is, the building blocks for art. For example, line, shape, color, form, texture, value, all of that. But today we're going to cover balance, movement, contrast, and we're going to look at a tool called the rule of thirds. So if we look at what movement is typically the visual flow within a composition. Now, a composition, that's just a big fancy word for things that work together to make a whole piece of art. What's it composed of? All those little elements, okay? So movement, its job is to guide your eye throughout the piece to a specific place, and that's called a focal point, okay? So if you're going to go on a vacation, you're not going to get very far unless you know exactly where you're going. And then you plot your route to your vacation point. Right? That's exactly what a graphic designer does. We design our movement with our focal point in mind. All right? So movement also keeps the eye from wandering off of the page. You don't want them to be looking at your piece and then suddenly notice the really pretty wallpaper on the wall behind it, all right? And movement that's successful also keeps the eye in constant motion. You never stop, really, on the piece. You're constantly flowing and moving throughout the composition. So here is the poster for Rogue One, and that is just epically awesome. So let's get right in here. So first, let's look at these figures. Do you see how they're all looking to the right? All right? Now, we're curious creatures, humans. All right, so we want to know what the heck are they looking at. So where they're pointing, that's going to guide our eye over here. And they are looking at these Imperial soldiers. Now, if you look at the shape of the beach down here, it also has this nice flow. It conforms up and sweeps over and it turns to the right, just the same direction as all these figures are looking. Now we have this figure and he's bigger than this one. So there's kind of a progression from a big figure to smaller and smaller and smaller as they get farther away. So that guides the eye as well, almost like arrows. See the tops of the trees? There's a reason why they go in this nice slant. See the tops of the bushes? You see how it joins together with the beach horizon? And then if we come over here, it's flat. And then sure enough, the trees over here do the exact same thing. Now let's look up a little bit more. Here's 3 X-Wing fighters. And if we continue looking up, look at the contrails of their jets. See, it's flowing down and it's following this beautiful flow from the beach to the action over here. Now, if we continue to go up, do you notice even, by the way, also that even this cloud here has an accelerated curve. It goes from big chunky to down and it sweeps and then it is carried up by the tops of the trees. And then we're caught here by the edge of this crescent from the Death Star. And we go up, 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 and around, and then we get sucked down into this vortex. Now, if our eye doesn't go there, it goes up and around, and once we get to the top of the piece, we've got this small little caption, "A rebellion built on hope." That kind of helps frame the composition, and since we read left to right, we start here and go here, and then the negative space can pull us back into the composition as well. So let's zoom out, and you can see the overall flow of this poster. That is movement. Now that was a really complicated example of movement, but movement doesn't have to always be complicated. You know, there are many varieties of different types of, say, paths that something can go on. And so if we look at this poster from 127 hours, you see it's mostly like a horseshoe pattern. You know, it comes up and goes down and sweeps around. And then we've got this negative space in the middle. And so the figure in the middle kind of bridges the gap of the movement, keeps the eye flowing in. And here is where our vacation is. This is our destination, our focal point, which is the title, 127 hours. Here's another example of a really, really cool composition that uses a very complex movement in it. And so first, let's identify the focal point. All right, focal point, he's showing us. This figure is pointing us to it, which is this hand using the top of the letter L as a knob for his DJ turntable, okay? So this area is where they want us to look, specifically like the title and all this action. And you can tell that there's all this convergence. Everything is pointing to this region. And so if we look, his dreadlocks pull us down to these angles, and his hand pulls us down to the knob, right? The sweeping curve of his arm does the exact same thing. Let's look at these buildings. Do you see the angle of these buildings over here? They get more and more accelerated the closer they get to the middle. So they're constantly pointing us, hey, look over here, all right? If my eye wanders up to the corner, look at these sponsor logos. You see this is a triangle, right? So my eye is gonna go left to right and get pulled back down, okay? If I look over here to this side, we've got a sentence that goes up, and all of a sudden, if my eye wants to wander, I read this sentence. And then we've got these accelerated hatch marks. Do you see how they're thicker on the left than they are on the right? That tells me that this is a beginning and this is an end. It pushes my eye back into the composition. And then once I get down here into the type, you know, it's just very chaotic and crazy, okay? I read the title and all the other texts and so on. So this would be an example of a triangular composition here. You see this figure is looking up and to the right. We're caught by the basketball hoop. It's pulled down by the hoop, and then the bright, bold text pulls us again to the left and the right. So we're caught into a triangle. You know, triangle is a very cool one. You could also do S curves. You could do an L shape. I'd encourage you guys to look on the internet and just kind of look at a variety of different compositions that you could use using movement. All right, here's a fun one. This one's called the rule of thirds. If you've ever taken like a video class or photography, you've definitely gotten this. And the rule of thirds is just this. What it does is you take a poster or a composition or a shot or a movie scene or whatever, and you divide it into 3 even rows and 3 even columns, okay? And so you end up with this tic-tac-toe grid on the composition. So if we look at the Star Wars poster, the grid looks like this. 3 even rows, 3 even columns. Now, the rule of thirds is used to help you know kind of where you want to put that family vacation destination, where you want that focal point, that main idea, that payoff that you want your viewer to spend the time working towards, okay? And there's a couple of ways to do that. First is anywhere you've got an intersection on this grid, that's called an action point. All right, and so this is what the Star Wars poster looks like with the rule of thirds, and you can see that the big vortex lands near this upper left action point. You don't have to be on it like a bullseye, just in close proximity, okay? Now the rule of thirds also groups space together for a specific purpose. So this one, if you notice, the battle scenes, all right, are down here, generally in this lower 1/3, and the remaining 2/3 of the poster is strictly devoted to like this open space and this crazy, ominous, epic scene, okay? And you're gonna see when we get to balance why they did it in a 1:2 ratio here. Let's take a look at this poster and see how the rule of thirds was used in it. So if I take this side, would be like 1 column, maybe a little wider. Here would be the middle, and here would be the left, all right? So we would have an action point here, 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 and here, okay? So this figure lands on the action point. Now also, look how they use the grid. This figure takes up 4 sections on the rule of thirds grid. Let's go back to the Star Wars. She takes up generally, this region right here, okay? Likewise, This area takes up this portion of space, which would be these two segments. And then the top is devoted strictly to 1/3 of it. So she used the grid to kind of partition off, to group sections of space in her composition, and it made for a really cool breakdown. Let's look at this piece and see what could we have done with action points to even enhance it even more. Some students said that not only what if her face was on the top left action point, what if she had the jewel a little higher so that it hit the bottom right action point? That would have been a little closer and made for an even more dynamic composition. Now that brings me to my second piece. Whenever you do the rule of thirds, try not to exceed more than 2 action points. If you go more than that, your viewer is going to have a hard time seeing what the main idea is. Moving right along, the next one is contrast. So contrast has a wide variety of applications in fine art, graphic design, painting, everything. Contrast means exploiting the differences between 2 or more elements for emphasis. Now that's a chunky sentence. To exploit means to use for your benefit, all right? And 2 or more, meaning you gotta have 2 things that are opposites, okay? So you're gonna exploit the difference between 2 things, and that's for a specific reason. That's for emphasis, right? So what are we gonna emphasize in a design based on what you've just learned? Well, you said it, that would be the focal point in the image, okay? So contrast is used in a variety of ways. First of all is putting patterns next to patternless things. So by putting an area that is full of pattern around something that has no pattern in it, that would draw attention to the thing that has no pattern, all right? We could put small things next to big things. Now let's see how they did that in this piece, all right? We've got small, or these are all small figures compared to this big Death Star, but we've got, bigger figures to smaller, so there's a relationship here on what's going on. We've also got small people and this massive big Death Star. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So that puts emphasis on probably the Death Star because it's so huge in relationship to the people. Here's a big one that's used in fine art is putting dark things besides light things. And that's a whole nother ball game, especially when you're talking about painting, shading, all that good stuff. But in graphic design, you'll hear me say it a lot, is contrast is one of the biggest things that we need to focus on. In order for the viewer to understand what they're looking at and to for us to guide them throughout the piece. So how is contrast used in this Star Wars poster? Well, we've got dark on light to make this really cool dish. We've got one really huge thing with many, many small things down here. That puts emphasis on the Death Star, right? We've also got, pattern, all these little dots, and then no pattern, okay? We've also got smooth sky, and then rough textured bottom over here. That really separates what's in the sky from the ground. Lastly, if we're looking at contrast, look, the title needs to stand out as well. And so they put the brightest, the brightest white right next to the darkest darks over here, and that is the widest gap of contrast, meaning, this is dark, this is light, versus, this is gray and this is light gray. There's way more contrast here than there is in this region. Okay, final one is a challenging one, and you'll see why. Balance, I've noticed students typically have some of the hardest time with this one. And balance, before we go into how to do it and what it is, let's just understand first balance in just its little building blocks, okay? So balance is how you spread the visual weight throughout a composition. You do not want all of your visual weight in one spot. And before we can talk about that, we need to know what the heck is visual weight. Well, that is an area that the eye is attracted to. It's a place where your eye wants to wander and check out. So things like that would be like words. If you see text on something, you're going to want to read it. Faces. We're attracted to, our eyes attracted to things such as people and faces in an image. We want to see, it's that human curiosity. What are they doing? What are they looking at? Why are they in there? And this is all on a subconscious level. Areas of high contrast are huge in terms of heavy weight. If you look at precious jewels and precious metals, the reason why we like them so much isn't just because they're rare, it's because they're shiny. And shiny things are when you put bright areas next to dark areas. That's high contrast. So the goal with achieving balance in your work is to distribute the weight in such a way that it does not affect one area over another in the piece. Not all weights are equal. So for example, if we had this little seesaw or teeter-totter, and we had a kitty cat and a dog, the cat, in order to balance out with the dog, would have to be like way on the outside, while the dog had to be like way close to the middle. And so that does not mean that you make everything even on both sides. That's where this term fulcrum comes to. Fulcrum is like where this seesaw would pivot, okay? So it's the balance point on the composition. Looking back at visual weight, look at this area of high contrast. We've got white on black. That's as extreme as you can get with darkness and light contrast. Well, over here we've got gray on white. That's nowhere near as heavy. So if we had two spheres of the same weight, this guy would be, or the same size, this guy would be way heavier than this guy. So in order to make it even, we had to enlarge the size of this circle to be way bigger than the circle on the left. There's two types of balance. There's asymmetrical balance and symmetrical balance. Symmetry means that something is the same on both sides. So if I draw this little box, draw a line down the middle, it's the same on the right as the left. Draw a line through the middle here, it's the same on the top as it is on the bottom. Now they both have different purposes. So generally, symmetrical balance is very direct and very loud and in your face, just like stop signs and traffic signs and so on. Its purpose is to catch your attention, but there's not much you can do with a symmetrical composition. You're a little more limited, and they can end up to be very boring. Sometimes. I've seen a lot of cool symmetrical compositions, but just generally speaking, this is what I usually see with students who limit themselves just to symmetry. Asymmetry is a lot more interesting, but it can be a lot more difficult to pull off. And you can't really get the same level of movement and flow and attention to focal point and rule of thirds that you can in an asymmetrical composition. Rotate a composition and put it on its side. You can put it vertical, you can put it upside down. I'd encourage you to do it in all of the above ways so that you can balance the piece out. And if we take this Star Wars poster, you see, here's our little teeter-totter. Notice that all the visually heavy areas, like the bold contrast, the colors, the action, all the busyness, takes up a very small amount of space here, actually, right about here. Okay, and all of this space on this left side is given over to sky, the Death Star, and so on. Here's some examples of some symmetrically balanced compositions, and by all means, I mean, they're not boring. They're really cool. I mean, look at Jaws. That's really iconic. We've got Finding Nemo. There's a lot happening in here. It's just typically what happens on the left happens on the right. Now with asymmetry, there's a couple of ways that you can successfully pull it off, okay? For starters, know that negative space, meaning stuff that nothing's happening in, that counts as an element in your visual weight. It's actually kind of like a negative, okay? There's nothing going on, there's no weight to it. And so by using large volumes of negative space, you can offset something that's very heavy. Another technique is to group or multiply. So if we look at this queen chess piece, in order to have balance, we have to multiply all these little pawns to offset what's happening with the queen. And here's a good analogy right here. So put lots of little things to offset a big thing. That's another way to do it. Grouping forms together draws the eye. You see a crowd, and you're like, well, what's going on over there? So if you're going to have a crowd, maybe leave them in one area and have a big thing over here to kind of counterbalance it. Well, everybody, this has been a little introduction to design principles and a few tools. We'll cover more of them in the next video. I hope that you found this helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in class.